that there are three areas outside of the United States that matter greatly for our security. And those three areas are Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Those are the three key areas of the world for us. Third area of the world that we care greatly about is the Persian Gulf. Notice I'm not saying the Middle East, I'm saying the Persian Gulf. We care about the Persian Gulf because there is oil there. There's no great power in the Persian Gulf, there's no great power in the Middle East, but there's oil there. And oil is the one critical resource that we are willing to fight and die over. We do not want a situation where any great power controls all of that oil, or any local power, be it Iran or Iraq, controls all that oil. The United States is about to undergo a fundamental transformation. Asia, East Asia in particular, is going to become the most important area of the world for us. Persian Gulf is going to become the second most important area of the world for us, and Europe is going to be a distant third. This is a transformation that is taking place that most people in the United States and most people abroad have not fully grasped. You want to fully grasp this, because this is going to be of tremendous importance for the rest of your life. The United States is shifting its gun sights from Europe to Asia in a really big way. And this is really all about the rise of China. So what I'm telling you here is that when you think about American grand strategy, it's important to understand that Northeast Asia, or East Asia as I now describe it, and the Persian Gulf are linked in very important ways because the Chinese economy is so heavily dependent on imported oil from the Gulf. And Europe will be a distant third. And the reason that Europe will be a distant third is that there is no great power in Europe today, be it Germany or Russia, that threatens to dominate the entire region. Now, let's switch gears and talk about U.S. strategies in the Persian Gulf. I just talked about all the different regions of the world, but you want to talk about how the United States has dealt with the Persian Gulf and the Middle East more generally over time. You want to understand what we're up to in that area. Now, 1945 to 1968, the United States cared greatly about the Gulf, in large part because the Soviet Union was adjacent to the Gulf. What's amazing about the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and most of you are all too young or too young to appreciate this, is the Soviet Union was a country that was physically located in Europe, the #1 area of the world for the United States outside of the Western Hemisphere, from a strategic perspective. It was physically located in Northeast Asia, the second most important area of the world for the United States, and it was adjacent to Iran. After the 1979 revolution in Iran, and I'll talk more about this in a second, we worried greatly about the Soviets invading Iran. So the three areas of the world that we cared the most about, we had the Soviets either physically there or right next door. So going back to 1945, we were worried about the Gulf and we were worried about the Soviets. The question is, how did we deal with the problem? From 45 to 68, we depended on the British. The Americans had no military forces of any significance in the region, nor did we build military forces to fight and die in the region. It was an area of great strategic importance, you understand that? But in a very important way, we passed the buck. We relied on the British, who had a rich history in the region, as you all know, to do the heavy lifting for us. In 1968, the British said they were too tired and too weak to continue policing the Gulf and to continue policing other areas east of Suez, and they were pulling back. So we were in a quandary as to what to do. What we did from 1968 to 1979 is we relied heavily on the Shah. we relied heavily on Iran and to a lesser extent on Saudi Arabia to keep peace and order in the Persian Gulf. Remember, we put the Shah back in power in 1953. 1953, put the Shah back in power. And we put back in power for a good reason. We wanted a friendly leader in Iran so that if a rainy day came along, we could rely on the Shah. And that's what happened in 1968, after the British reduced their influence. From 1968 to 1979, we relied on Iran. In 1979, there was the revolution in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. U.S.-Iranian relations went down the toilet bowl, and the United States, for the first time, had to develop its own military forces to fight in the Gulf. And we developed the famous Rapid Deployment Force, the RDF. It was an offshore capability. It was an over-the-horizon capability. It was a military force that was stationed outside of the region and designed to be able to move quickly into the region if need be. We were an offshore balancer from 1979 to 1991. Even though we had this powerful military force that could be used in the region, we went to great lengths not to keep it in the region. Then, in 1991, on August 2nd, 1991, you all know what happened. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. George H.W. Bush was the president. He said that was unacceptable, and we decided to go to war against Saddam Hussein to throw him, or to throw his military, out of Kuwait. We did that, of course, in January, February 1991. Saddam, again, invaded Kuwait August 2nd, 1990, and then we fought the war, first Gulf War, January, February 1991. The first elements that went into Saudi Arabia to fight that war were the RDF forces. And then we brought other forces from Germany in as well, and we won a great victory. We threw Saddam's forces out of Kuwait, and Kuwait regained its independence, and Iraq indeed suffered a humiliating defeat. Then, under the Clinton administration, we made a fatal mistake. Instead of winning the war and then moving back offshore, we decided to stay in the region physically. We decided to stay there. And we decided that instead of letting Iran and Iraq check each other, we would take it upon ourselves to check both countries. It was called dual containment. Let me explain to you what happened there. You all remember the Iraq-Iran War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. Iran versus Iraq. The United States actually assisted Iraq in that war. You've seen the famous pictures of Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein standing next to each other, smiling. What was going on there is that we were in the period 79 to 91, that's when the 80 to 88 war took place, offshore balancing. We were playing the local powers off against each other. We were letting Iran and Iraq check each other, which is exactly what we should have done. We abandoned that policy in the first year of the Clinton administration, and we decided instead that we would keep forces in the region, no more over-the-horizon capability, and that we would check both Iran and Iraq ourselves. That's dual containment. Now, what happens here is we get more and more involved. We've got forces in Saudi Arabia, and this is one of the principal motivating factors behind Osama bin Laden's attack on the United States on September 11th. Osama bin Laden was greatly bothered by the fact that the American military was physically located in Saudi Arabia. Right? So what happens in 2001 is the United States gets whacked. And what does the United States decide to do as a consequence? George W. Bush is now the president. We decide to abandon dual containment and adopt an offensively oriented policy of regime change. And that, of course, is what I'm going to talk about today, because I'm going to talk about U.S. Middle East policy from 2001 forward. I'm going to get to that in a second. The policy from 2001 forward is regime change. But what I've done here, what I've tried to do, is I want to walk you through the evolution of U.S. policy towards the Gulf since 1945, because it's important that you understand the context. You understand where regime change came from. The story that I'm telling you here about American Middle East policy from 45 forward is that from 45 to 79, the United States basically relied on others to do the heavy lifting in the Gulf. We did not have the military capability to do much of anything in the Gulf from 45 to 79. We relied first on the British, then mainly on the Iranians, and lesser on the Saudis. Then, when it became clear that we were going to have to build military forces to deal with the region, we developed an over-the-horizon capability. We acted as an offshore balancer. We did not go onshore because we understood we'd get into trouble if we did. Okay? That all ended in 91. Actually, in 92. That all ended, and what happened is we moved to dual containment. But it's containment, which is much more defensive in nature than regime change, which is offensive in nature. Then comes September 11th. We adopt regime change under George W. Bush, which is continued under President Obama. No meaningful difference between George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Their foreign policies in the region are very similar. 5 big targets: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Egypt. All 5 of these abject failures. By the way, just talking about Iraq and Afghanistan, estimates are that it will ultimately cost the United States somewhere between $4 to $6 trillion for those 2 wars. Almost 7,000 Americans dead, many, many more Americans badly wounded as a result. And what's the end result? We lost both wars. Then there's Syria, which is probably the biggest mess of all. The United States, of course, played a key role there. We did not invade Syria, but we have been deeply involved in trying to bring Assad down since 2005. The Bush administration had its gun sights on Syria for a long time. I believe that we helped precipitate the revolution against Assad in 2011. And we have been funding the jihadis. We sometimes refer to them as moderate forces arrayed against Assad. We've been fueling that civil war. Colonel Gaddafi, of course, was eventually killed. What's the end result? Chaos in Libya. I just want to back up a second here. You understand what the American goal was. The American goal was regime change. The American goal was to get rid of leaders like Saddam, leaders like Colonel Gaddafi, and replace them with democratically elected governments on the assumption that you would then have a stable and prosperous political system in place. We were not just bringing down regimes with the thought in mind that we were going to sow chaos and disorder. That's what's happened, of course. This is my basic point here, that the United States has failed at almost every turn. We thought we were going to do good. I want to be very clear here. People like George W. Bush were not trying to wreck these countries on purpose. They inadvertently ended up wrecking these countries because regime change was a harebrained scheme. That's the basic point. We have failed at almost every turn. By the way, for those of you who talk about international law, the United States is very big at pointing the finger at other countries and saying, you violated international law. What we did in Libya, what we're doing in Syria, is a violation of international law. We're violating the sovereignty of these countries. Finally, there's Egypt. And here the story is somewhat different, although the basic end result is not that different. The United States was interested in promoting democracy in all of these countries, and that includes Egypt. And when Hosni Mubarak, who was a dictator, was removed from power in Egypt, and the United States helped give him a gentle push out of office, there was great hope that democracy would actually be put in place in Egypt. There was an election, actually, in Egypt in June 2012, and the problem was, from the American perspective, the Muslim Brotherhood won. So you got regime change, and you got a democratically elected leader, but he was from the Muslim Brotherhood. And this was not good from an American perspective. But nevertheless, the Americans, much to their credit, did nothing about it. The leader remained in place, Morsi, for about 1 year. And what happened was all sorts of dissent began to emerge in Egypt. And there was a movement to topple Morsi, to have a coup against Morsi, because most people in the Egyptian establishment were unhappy with a Muslim Brotherhood leader running the country. So what happened was there was a coup in July of 2013. Now remember what happened here. Mubarak is overthrown in early 2011, then you have an election in June of 2012, right? And Morsi, the leader, Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood leader, takes office. And then a year later, in July 2013, you have a coup. The United States went along with the coup. The United States was not the principal cause of the coup. And I've tried to go to great lengths here to say that the United States is not the only force at play in the region. And that's certainly the case with Egypt. But you had a coup in July 2013, and Morsi was removed from power. And who took his place? A general, a thug, a dictator. So no democracy in Egypt. And by the way, he then went out and took vengeance against the Muslim Brotherhood. And roughly 1,400 members of the Muslim Brotherhood were murdered in the wake of the coup. And you ended up with a non-democratic leader. End result, another example of failure. So basically, you had 5 big operations that were all designed to produce regime change, which would lead to a democratic and prosperous political order in each of those 5 countries. And what's the end result? 0 for 5. Global domination. And this is the idea that the United States should dominate the globe. There are no 3 important areas. All areas are important. You dominate the globe. You're willing to use military force anywhere. I think this view is best captured by Madeleine Albright's famous or infamous, depending on your viewpoint, comments that we are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further. This is Madeleine Albright basically saying that we not only have a right, but we have a responsibility to run the world. We have the right to stick our nose in everybody else's business. Right? Global domination. Global domination is the grand strategy that we adopted after 1989. And it remains our grand strategy. We believe that we have a responsibility to run the world. It's imperial by design. Now, very importantly, there are two kinds of global dominators. One are the neoconservatives, who are aligned in large part with the Republican Party, and two are the liberal imperialists who are aligned with the Democratic Party. And let me tell you what the difference between the two is. The difference is that the neoconservatives hate international institutions and privilege the unilateral use of military force. The liberal imperialists, on the other hand, love international institutions. They're always talking about multilateralism, which is a euphemism for institutions. They love international institutions, and they're not unwilling to use military force, but they're quite skittish.
Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other.
They misunderstood why they hate us. This is a key issue. The question is, why did they attack us on September 11th? Why do they hate us? There are two possible answers. They hate us because of who we are, or they hate us because of our policies. Those are the only two possible answers, okay? We, of course, were not going to say they hated us because of our policies in the wake of September 11th, because if they hated us because of our policies, then we, in part, would have been to blame for what happened on September 11th. So we had to tell the story that they hated us because of who we are. They hate our democratic values, they hate the fact that we treat women as equals, and so forth and so on. You know the litany of charges. The truth is, there is a huge amount of survey data on this. There is a huge amount of anecdotal evidence on this, and they don't hate us because of who we are. They hate us because of our policies. Okay? But we said they hate us because of who we are. Right? Now think about this. Remember the Bush Doctrine. What was the Bush Doctrine all about? The Bush Doctrine was all about going into the Middle East and turning countries like Iraq into democracies. It was all about speeding up the Fukuyama process, right? In other words, what we were saying is, if they hate us because of who we are, we can't change who we are, so we're going to change who they are. We're going to make them look like us. I was adamantly opposed to the Iraq War, as many of you know, and I have many conservative friends, and I used to say to them in the run-up to the war, how can conservatives like you support this war? And they would say, why aren't you supporting this war, right? You're a conservative. And I'd say, anybody who's got a conservative bone in their body should be opposed to this whole operation because it's social engineering on a grand scale. This is one of the most radical foreign policy endeavors I've ever seen in my life. The idea that a bunch of white people are going to come across the Atlantic Ocean and do massive social engineering in the Arab and Islamic world at the end of a rifle barrel, that's a conservative policy? Not on the planet I come from, right? This is, nutty, right? But again, if you have come to the conclusion that it's not our policies, and you do not want to change our policies, and instead you believe it's due to the fact that they hate democracy and who we are, then you change who they are. And that's what the Bush Doctrine was all about. This is a fundamental mistake. What they really hated, right, was, number one, the fact that we had troops in Saudi Arabia. People in the Arab and Islamic world do not like us occupying their territory. So, of course, we now have troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was no al-Qaeda problem in Iraq until we went in there. Now there's al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, right? They hate us because of sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s that killed probably about 500,000 innocent Iraqis. They hate us because of our support for Israel and its occupation of the Palestinian territories, right? They hate us because we have supported all these thuggish governments in the Middle East for decades, Barack Obama pretends like we're embracing democracy, like we're this great friend of democracy in the Middle East. Who is he kidding? We've been supporting these thugs. We helped put many of them in power. We've kept them there for years. We've been no friend of democracy in the Middle East. One of the principal reasons there's no democracy in the Middle East is the United States of America. Everybody knows that. But the people in that region don't like our policies. You can disagree with them, but they don't like the policies. And actually, many of them like the United States and like American values. The problem, nevertheless, is that to win a counterinsurgency, whether you're the British in Malaysia, the Americans in Vietnam, or the Americans in Afghanistan and Iraq, the problem is that it takes well over 10 years to win a counterinsurgency, assuming you can do it. But if it takes you 10 years, you cannot float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. And floating like a butterfly and stinging like a bee was the key to the Bush doctrine. Because we were going to do Afghanistan, then we were going to do Iraq. Pull back out, reload the shotgun, do Iran, do Syria. Pretty soon everybody would be so scared they'd just throw their hands up and jump on the American bandwagon. You know, the Israelis, when they heard in early 2002, remember Afghanistan, we're talking December 2001. Early 2002, the Israelis get wind that we're thinking of doing Iraq. And they send a team over here to say, are you guys crazy? Iran is the real threat, not Iraq. Why aren't you doing Iran? What we convinced the Israelis is that we're going to do Iraq first, because it's the low-hanging fruit, and then we're going to do Iran. And then we're going to do Syria, right? So the Israelis actually get on board for doing Iraq, but they keep reminding us, don't forget, when you're done with Iraq, you got to do Iran, right? And see, we say, don't worry, not only are we going to do Iran, we're going to do Syria. Because again, the name of the game here is to transform the entire region. It gets back to that question, why do they hate us? If you think about it. They hate us because of who we are, therefore we have to transform them and change who they are. And we think we can do it with military force. But again, what happened in Afghanistan was a mirage. And that's why all these Democrats were fools to abandon their skepticism about military force.
Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we.